Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you this morning. Of course, it would be much better to be together again in person, but not yet, and not for a while. In this time of isolation, social unrest, pandemic, and well, that's just to name a few of the issues giving rise to the crisis in our America the Beautiful. I again would like to remind us and always remember who we are. We are Unitarian Universalists. Our Unitarian heritage calls us to recognize the inherent good of all people and all beings. While the Universalist part of our tradition encourages us to extend love and acceptance to all people. Our guest speaker this morning is our newly elected Vice President and our good friend, Janeane Reagan. And in just a bit, we also have a special appearance from our very special snowbird, I hate that word, Peter Pitzele. Zoom's grand. We can get people from all over to join us. Peter will be reading one of his many beautiful poems titled A Purpose. Our world is heading for a crisis, bringing with it worry, sadness, anger, anxiety, depression, and doubt. If we're feeling these things, I just can't imagine what the children are feeling. I know little kids can bounce back more easily than we adults, but how much can their little minds take? They are in a time where their little minds are being molded into the adults they will become, and they are our future. Now, I don't have little grandkids, and I don't have any little kids in my life right now. So I don't watch Disney movies. But while searching for opening words, I found hope. I found quotes, little hidden gems strategically placed in the Disney movies that I know kids watch over and over and over again. especially in this time of isolation, it did give me hope for the future, as they are being taught beauty, acceptance, adversity, and love. And here are just a few of the quotes that I found. You think the only people are the people who look and think like you. But if you walk the footsteps of a stranger, you learn things you never knew. Disney movie, Pocahontas. You got to let go of that past because it just doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what you choose to be now. Disney movie, Kung Fu Panda. The past can hurt, but the way I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it. Disney movie, The Lion King. The flower that blooms in adversity is the most rare and beautiful of all. Disney movie, The Emperor of China. Sometimes we only see how people are different than us. But if you look hard, you can see how much we're all alike. And what do you see? Lion King. Now, I know lied. Of course, that's Pinocchio. And I'll finish with a quote from Walt Disney himself. All our dreams can come true if you have the courage to pursue them. Walt Disney. Thank you. And now it's time to light our chalice. Okay, we'll pretend I have a chalice. I can't see anybody, by the way, or anything, so you can see this. Get your candles and or flames, and we'll light our chalice together. We have a calling in this world. We are called to honor diversity, to respect differences with dignity, and to challenge those who forbid it. We are people of a wide path. Let us be wide in affection and go our way in peace. Click. I'll light it in a minute. And now we'll hear Spirit of Life. I can't hear him.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good, thank you. I was on mute. A rare state for me to be in. So good morning, you all. I'm speaking to you from the Hudson Valley, about 75 miles north of New York. It's very beautiful here, and it's relatively safe here. We have great outdoors, and we can be in the outdoors without concern. And I'm here by invitation of Janeane, who is one of the folks who receives from time to time some things that I write. Phyllis is another, and there are a few of you on this dubious list. And Janeane invited me to read something I wrote recently, and I'm very grateful to have this chance to do it, although it was not something I wrote thinking about it being a public statement, so to speak, but here it is. And just the orientation to it is that like many people, I have been going back to school. It's a school of being self-taught to a certain extent that has been necessitated by my response to the uproar and concerns around racism. And this has brought some realizations to me. And this poem or these words are an expression of how I'm working with these realizations. The poem is called A Purpose. And let me just say that the inspiration for this poem, or the crucible out of which this poem came, was my reading of the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. It's part of what is sort of bringing me to my senses. A purpose. I am white in America. I swim in racism the way a fish swims in water. I'm not alone in the sea. I belong to a school of white fish, where I have been taught that I am an individual and that I can look at things as they are. But I have not learned to see how I am a fish who looks at things through schooled white eyes. I am colorblind with unearned advantages, unlearned advantages, because I am white schooled. These advantages are numerous and particular, and they are white. I can name some of them. Some are invisible still. I need help to see my colorblind spots. Talk to me. If I resist knowing, I will examine that resistance. I will not assume that it's justified. This will be a practice for me. It will be a purpose.
Yeah, I got a bunch of
Silence. Silence. Shh. Silence. Thank you, Peter. Now, if you will recite our Congregational Covenant. I do not have it and I do not see the screen. So could someone lead with that, please?
Tastes like molasses.
Love.
I know all of us, we can't hear this.
What
I might get one of these.
is going on?
Oh, okay. Right.
You're okay.
One of these that here, you know, pick it up and throw it underneath it. Pick it up. You want to carry it?
Oh.
Chris, could you put the covenant up again?
Please. Thank you.
Yeah.
Someone please read it.
I'll read it when he gets to that
Thank you.
slide.
Okay, thank you.
There you go.
Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
Thank you so much, Val. Our Unitarian Universalist congregation of Lake County works at creating a beloved community among ourselves and in our community, in our world. We share a dream of being a church for all peoples and beings, as well as a church of the earth. We will listen now to some music by Logan, and this is the time for offering. There will be instructions on the screen if you'd like to offer, make an offering, and or listen to the music. Thank you in advance.
morning. Implicit biases, part of being human. When I first wrote this sermon as part of Reverend Tracy's preaching class last fall, I had no idea how relevant this topic was going to be in our lives today. How much we would be hearing the term implicit bias used in the media, particularly as it pertains to police training. But I would like to start by sharing with you an experience I had last summer, well before the COVID-19 pandemic hit us. Okay. One evening when my husband Bernie, that most of you know, and I had the occasion to visit the emergency room at the local hospital, along with a friend who was having chest pains. It was the usual routine. The EMT squad came to her house and took her to the hospital. We followed in the car. And because of some mix-up in her name, we didn't actually get in to see her for about an hour and a half. But then when we got in there, they were doing the usual tests, and we were waiting with her all wrapped up in blankets because ERs are always so frigid. And we were anticipating the results of her test. A nurse popped in occasionally with an update, and then finally, about 10:30, she told us that everything looked good so far, but there was always, one more test to be done before she could be discharged. So shortly after 11:30, she let us know that the results looked good, no evidence of a heart attack, and that our friend's discharge paperwork would follow shortly. Well, shortly in the ER is a relative term, right? So 40 minutes later, before, we actually saw anybody. And at that time, a young, short, slightly overweight Black woman with lots of braids, dressed in dark gray scrubs, with a stethoscope around her neck, entered the room and stood at the end of our friend's bed. She began to talk about discharge and follow-up. I was sitting to the side, so I couldn't see her name tag. Partway through the conversation, however, I realized, much to my great surprise, that this was the doctor. I was immediately struck by the degree of surprise I experienced in this revelation. I was surprised at my surprise. But frankly, I was too tired to think about it any further at that time and turned my focus toward getting our friend back to her house and us back to our beds. The next morning, as I was lying in my own bed doing a little review of the previous night, I could not keep my mind off how surprised I had been that this young woman was the doctor. After all, I'm an enlightened baby boomer. I shouldn't have such biases. I've worked hard to see the world and those in it in an accepting and non-judging way. So I got up and I grabbed a piece of scrap paper and I started to write down all the variables that I thought might have been a factor in my perception that this woman had to be a nurse or a clerk or something other than the doctor. It went kind of like this. If the person had been a tall white guy, would I have seen him right away as the doctor? Absolutely. If the person had been a tall Black guy, probably. An Indian or Asian male, most likely. A tall white woman, maybe, maybe not. A tall Black woman, oh, maybe, maybe not. An Indian woman, probably. They're never nurses. Oh, is that a bias? An older person? Well, you get it. I went through it all: race, height, body build, age, gender, hair, dress. What I concluded was that I still expect doctors to be older white males, and it would help if they would wear a white coat. There was no white coat. Oh yes, I'm still looking for Marcus Welby or Dr. Kildare. In the absence of familiar cues, my mind went to other stereotypes that had dominated the culture in which I had grown up, such as women are nurses, men are doctors. Doctors are older people who don't look like they just came out of high school. Oh, is that an age bias? I was not happy about any of this insight. I wanted to think of myself as having put these biases about roles away in favor of a broader perspective because after all, I'm a UU. But as a psychologist, I know that a great deal of what we think, say, and how we act is impacted by the beliefs and feelings that reside in our unconscious minds and got created a long time ago. It can be helpful to think of our conscious mind and our unconscious mind like an iceberg. The small portion that is visible above the waterline is the conscious part.
Macron.
Nope, we've got somebody talking. While the much larger part, lying unseen below the surface, is like our unconscious mind. What we do, why we do it throughout the day is largely a function of stuff in the bottom. My favorite example of this process is learning to drive a car. Think about it when you first learned to drive a car, how consciously you had to do each thing, putting the key in the ignition, put your foot on the brake, checking the rearview mirrors. But after many repetitions, our brains download the whole routine into the iceberg below the surface where we can just use it automatically. While this example is primarily a motor skill, the same thing happens with our beliefs and how we think about ourselves and the world. You see, our brains have a natural tendency to make automatic judgments about peoples and groups based upon the survival needs of our early ancestors. That is, having to recognize quickly who was part of your tribe, who was friend, who was foe. It has been important to be efficient in discerning danger from not danger. The development of stereotypes has been part of the efficiency, for better or for worse. The learning of relevant cues for such decisions begins early in life and is clearly evident by age 3. The two most influential sources being our immediate culture, family, friends, teachers. And in modern times, the other is the media, particularly TV and social media. As social psychologists examine trends in these last two influences, TV and social media, they're finding, as you might suspect, that social media is becoming more powerful in this area, even surpassing the influence of family in many cases. And that's a whole topic for another time. According to Keith Payne, professor of psychology and neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill, having stereotypes pop into our minds happens to most people all the time. That, on its own, doesn't make you a racist, a sexist, or a whateverist. It just means that your brain's working properly, noticing patterns, and making generalizations. But the same thought processes that make people smart can also make them biased. He goes on to say that this tendency for stereotype confirming thoughts to pass spontaneously through our minds is what psychologists call implicit bias. It sets people up to overgeneralize and sometimes leading to discrimination even when people think they're being fair. Payne, who has researched extensively on racial bias, goes on to highlight examples of research on how the real world discrimination continues and is widespread. Recent events in our country has again made us look at the role of such bias in police actions, but Payne's research has shown us how subtle these biases can operate throughout our culture. For instance, white applicants get about 50% more callbacks than Black applicants for the same job with exactly the same resume. College professors are 26% more likely to respond to a student's email when it is signed by Brad than when it is signed by Lamar. Physicians recommend less pain medication for Black patients than white patients with the same injury. And these examples are only looking at racial bias. Many other types of bias have been studied, including gender, body type, disability, culture, politics, age, and even music preference, just to name a few. Bias can be explicit as well as implicit. That is, some biases we're very conscious of. Take, for example, our political biases. What do you tell yourself about the guy parked ahead of you in the gas station line when you see a certain bumper sticker on his pickup truck? But implicit biases, however, tend to sneak up on us, influencing our actions in ways we never realized. Diversity consultant and passionate speaker on implicit biases, Verna Myers, describes biases as the stories we make up about people before we know who they are. Listen to that again. The stories we make up about people before we know who they are. Think about what happens in your head when you meet someone for the first time, or when you see someone doing something you don't understand. Our brains want to make sense out of our experience, so we will fill in with what is missing in our understanding. Our biases are often the sources of the material for the fill-in. Myers' definition came home to me this past winter when I was watching the NPR documentary Country Music by Ken Burns and realized that I had no idea who Johnny Cash really was. My story about him was that he was a country singer with kind of a rough history, including drug use and a kind of hillbilly style that was really not my cup of tea. But I did kind of like his song, A Boy Named Sue. I had never seen him for the impact he had in breaking down racial and gender barriers across the entire music scene in the 50s and 60s. Of the 8 segments of Burns' program, 8 of them revisited Cash's career at various points, his highs and his lows. But each episode presented examples of ways in which he brought Black musicians and female singers into his concerts and his TV specials in ways that had been unheard of in country music to that time. Oh, and also how the Beatles were influenced by his music. Wow, who knew? Well, I now have a very different story about Johnny Cash. So if implicit bias is so sneaky, how is it studied? Well, one way of examining implicit bias has been the use of specifically designed tests, the most popular being the implicit association test and the Harvard implicit bias test. Both have been used for decades to research the occurrence of many different biases among large demographic groups. While these instruments are best used to look at trends across groups, they can be useful in making us aware of biases we may not realize we have and that still operate to influence our behaviors, both verbal and nonverbal. If you're curious and a little bit brave, you can be part of the research by Googling Harvard Implicit Bias Test and opting into the Implicit Project. There you can pick from several different biases, take as many tests as you want, and get immediate results about the direction and strength of biases that you might have. The tests use reaction times, so it's pretty hard to fake it. Another concept that is related to implicit bias is microaggression. We heard about microaggressions from Iman Sykes in a service last year. Microaggressions are defined as brief, subtle, stunning insults that can be verbal, nonverbal, or visual. They include everyday exchanges that send demeaning messages through intonation, gestures, and dismissive looks or put-downs. And they're directed to certain individuals because of their group membership. If my bias for who can be a doctor had translated into an action such as saying to that young woman, "Oh, you're the doctor?" Or, "Does our friend have to see the doctor before she can be discharged?" It would have become a microaggression. If letting these sneaky biases have their way with you is something you really don't want, here are some suggestions on how you can confront your implicit biases, at least the ones that you become aware of. First of all, when a bias in the form of an automatic thought, feeling, or action pops up, notice it without judging or beating yourself up. When you beat yourself up, you've only increased your angst and often your shame about it. And that produces no change in the stuff below the waterline of your iceberg. Start with some compassion for your own dilemma. Look at the event with curiosity about the triggers. What might have brought this bias up from the depths? Take into account your resources at the time. It's almost midnight. I'm cold, I'm tired, I'm hungry. And there was no white coat. Because we know that when we are under stress, when resources are low, or when we are frightened, our higher thinking brain tends to go offline and we function from more of the stuff in the lower iceberg. Verna Myers calls this our default settings. How else can we change an ingrained default bias? Change can happen through exposure and repetition. If you identify a bias that just seems stuck in the bottom of that iceberg of yours, one way to start melting it is to create enough experience to change your default setting. For example, let's say you are a business owner who's interviewing job candidates for a supervisory position in your business. Your conscious self says that you give everyone equal consideration, but when you've taken the Harvard implicit test, you find your default setting still shows a very strong preference for people without disabilities over people that have disabilities. To add to the evidence, videos of your past interviews with applicants clearly show that when conducting an interview with a person with a disability, such as someone in a wheelchair, your behaviors are different. Your eye contact, how much you smile, sitting forward, sitting back, fidgeting with your pen, they're different. Plus your track record shows that you just don't hire people with disabilities. These results are upsetting and embarrassing, but now you know. So you decide you will go after that bias and change it as much as you can. You call in your diversity consultant who suggests that you create exposure by looking at pictures of people with disabilities functioning in job situations. So you do this every day for 2 weeks by reading stories and accounts of people with disabilities who have been successful in the workplace. Then you find an opportunity to work with people with disabilities on a project that incorporates common goals, such as a community project. You probably won't totally eliminate that default setting, but you can create an awareness that helps you reduce the influence that that old stuff has on decisions that you're making in the present. Attempts to reduce the impact of implicit racial bias on police officers has been highlighted recently in numerous news interviews with police chiefs, mayors, and governors. However, if you look at implicit bias awareness training for police, you will find that such training varies from a 1-hour course to many hours. Officers themselves admit that they were so bored with it that they read their emails, took a nap. Evaluation of such programs show mixed results. Some have suggested that programs as they exist today can even have a negative effect on police actions. What is often overlooked with the implementation of such programs is that racism is a much more complex issue than just implicit bias within an individual. Racism is a function of history, culture, institutional imperatives, and much more. Implicit bias is a part of that complexity. While racial biases exist in everyone of every race, those of us who identify as white have perhaps the toughest road in exploring our biases. We must face the reality that our biases, implicit and explicit, are part of the fabric of who we are, even if they're not who we want to be. Numerous authors and researchers have written on the topic of white racism, several of whom have offered models for addressing it for those who are willing to do so. Shelley Touchlock, in her 2010 book, Witnessing Whiteness, states, since admonishing and shaming people is not likely to inspire either personal or political change, this book uses a different approach. It offers an invitation that hopefully piques interest and inspires thought. She goes on to say, I hope this book convinces readers that perceiving whiteness and developing active responses is imperative personally, socially, and politically if we are to transform our society into a more equitable and just place. Part of Touchlock's approach is the formation of groups on a kind of AA model where white people gather to deeply explore who they are, an awareness that she says is necessary before we can truly enter into the larger conversation about race. Recently on a CBS special, several groups that have developed from her model were interviewed. Their members emphasized that gaining true awareness and understanding must be an ongoing process with considerable dedication. Most of them had been in their group for at least 6 years. Since the killing of George Floyd prompted an urgent call to combat racism in our country, Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Become an Anti-Racist, has also gained much attention. Kendi tells us the opposite of racist isn't not racist. It is anti-racist. Like fighting an addiction, being an anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination. To be an anti-racist, he says, is a radical choice in the face of this history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness. This fall, our Lifespan Development Committee here at UUCLC will be offering a Zoom book discussion group, which will study various books about white privilege. Chris Cleveland is heading that up, and she says she will probably start with Kendi's book. Well, so often we are like the Titanic. We just don't see the bottom of the iceberg until we run into it. But we have much better sonar than the Titanic. We can equip ourselves with awareness and determination that both recognizes our humanness in combating our biases and motivates us to take the steps necessary to make the tough changes. I, for one, will probably never be as surprised at who can be the doctor. Thank you.
My plans fly out the window, agenda's broken down. There's nothing else to do right now but stop and look around. People frozen in their tracks are dealing with the same. And now is not the time or place to find someone to blame. When the universe is ready, so am I. When the universe is ready, so am I. The mighty sands are shifting by and by. When the universe is ready, so am I. We have bottled up our oceans, we have fouled up all the air. For the poison of our progress, we are fully unprepared. For the consequence of actions, for these outcomes we've brought forth, it is time to pay attention to the wisdom of the earth. When the universe is ready, so am I. When the universe is ready, so am I. The mighty sands are shifting by and by. When the universe is ready, so am I. Behold a new beginning, a vision like a star. Mother Earth self-regulates when we have gone too far. I'm looking out my window, I see my neighbor wave. We're singing from this distance, and we're closer to the day, and closer to the moment when we have our sweet embrace. What a blessing it will be to meet you in that place when the universe is ready. So am I. When the universe is ready, so am I. The mighty sands are shifting by and by. When the universe is ready, so am I.
And our closing words for today: peacemaking doesn't mean passivity. It is the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice. The act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer. The act of finding a third way that is neither fight nor flight, but the careful, arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice. It is about the revolution of love that is big enough to set both the oppressed and the oppressor free. Shane Claiborne, Common Prayer, a liturgy for ordinary radicals. And now join me as we extinguish our chalice for today. And stay with us for our cares and concerns with Kristen. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. If everybody could hear, wave your hands. Hello. Well, we're here at our beautiful downtown Taj Mahal in Highland Lakes, Florida, with our cat playing at our feet, basking in the wonderful words of Janeane and the amazing poem of Peter. Thank you all for everything you did to pull this together. It's an amazing service. And thank you all for your patience with our technical learning. So today's joys and concerns. Everybody's on. We've had as many as 44 people on this morning. And it's really been fun to watch everybody's reactions as we go through the service this morning. So Susie has a hand up.